Hello, I'm Gareth, Hector here at Westwood Global Energy Group with David Linden today, who I'm sure you all know from the Energy Transition Now podcast. Today we're going to be looking back over Series 5 of the podcast, the mini-series on offshore wind. I'm going to speak to David about why we chose to do this as a mini-series and the people that came on board, and generally just do a recap of some of the key moments from this series. David.
Hello.
Good to have roles reversed again.
Absolutely, always a pleasure. Thank you, Gareth.
Our question's easy also because we've discussed them ahead. I think it's probably just worth a recap on why we chose to just do the mini-series first of all. Obviously lots of subjects, wind's hot, but why specifically now and this?
Super question, Gareth, thank you. Essentially the Offshore Wind sort of mini podcast series has been around trying to focus on something, right? We've had a really great sort of run. The last sort of 25 plus episodes have been with individuals that have been leading change in the energy transition. We've really covered why strategies change, which technology is going to make a difference. And now we wanted to start to focus on really a specific technology that we see is making core difference. There is a minor bias to it all because it's an area we particularly focus on, but there's also a lot of change going on in that industry specifically that I think was worth discussing and debating. So this was really an opportunity to get under the sort of skin of really what's going on in an industry that's going to make quite a big difference to the energy transition, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, so point. So, with that in mind, why did we have on the people we had on in this series?
Excellent question. So, as we always try to do in the Energy Transition Now sort of podcast series, is to get a variety of views as to what's going on. So again, if you want to go with the mindset of how we get under the skin, we kind of need to understand the perspective from folks who are dealing maybe with markets that are brand new or markets that are more mature. We need to understand, for example, how different regions will be operating or developing versus others. But also there are the technologies to consider, the challenges that need to overcome, but also some of the kind of broader questions maybe you aren't always thinking about, right? So, for example, in offshore wind, it's all really about cost. So how do you think maybe about some of the other issues? So our last podcast is an example about sustainability and the question sustainability, within that market. So it's really about trying to get different perspectives and trying to tackle the different areas that are most important to that market right now.
Yeah, and I suppose we don't have to go through in order, but there's things that connect each one of them together. But just to start off with, you mentioned about sustainability, you mentioned about cost inflation, particularly along the white paper that we released a few weeks ago. Where do you start off? If someone's just coming in, where do you point them to first in terms of the podcast?
Excellent question. So we did structure it the way it is for a reason, so hopefully I can almost take you through it in that way, because actually that's not a bad way of thinking about the world, right? So historically offshore wind has been bounded, should we say, within the North Sea. There are obviously other instances of China now as a big market, but the North Sea has been the starting point, the epicenter of what's been going on. So our first podcast was actually with the World Bank, and their job obviously is to deal with developing markets. And if you're thinking about technology you traditionally associate with what we call a mature economy now being deployed in developing economies, it really gives you a real sense of what it takes to go from zero to something in a market. And so that podcast is actually a useful starting point because, as I said, it's a useful place to think about, well, if you haven't got any offshore wind, what do you need to think about, right? And if you think about offshore wind is currently at 62 gigawatts or so, or at the end of last year was at 62 gigawatts. The potential that we talk about in that podcast of 13,000 gigawatts in 75 different countries, developing countries, so outside of the traditional areas. We're talking about thinking about what we've dealt with that 0.5% of the
It's a massive number.
It's a massive number, exactly right.
Yeah.
So that is a good starting point. And the series kind of talks you through then different focus areas and questions, almost walks you through that before you get to that sustainability point, which I think is a kind of specific area which is going to you need to think about.
Like you say, it's almost like we planned it. Well, look, let's have a listen back. This is Mark Labourne of the World Bank.
So I think you need three fundamentals. One is good technical conditions. Is it windy? Is it shallow enough? Is it not too deep? There's not too many environmental and social issues. Secondly, is there a good role for offshore wind? How does it fit into the energy mix and the future country's future context for energy? And I suppose thirdly, is there government demand? Is there a client government that is actually wanting this? Because we're not here to sell them a technology. It has to make sense, and they have to also want it and buy into it. So the starting point really was looking at the technical conditions and seeing, okay, where does this look to be most attractive for offshore wind? That's the starting point. Start having those discussions with governments. When there's an engagement and somebody says, yes, actually, this is quite interesting, can we find out more? Then we slowly progress that dialogue and the analysis. And that starts, I suppose, when we start to find out what the role of offshore wind is, because it's different in every single country. It's not just about providing large-scale renewable energy generation. It could be diversifying the energy mix. It could be filling in the gaps where hydro resources is lower. It could be providing jobs. Every country has got its different drivers for doing this.
So that was Mark Labourne from World Bank, and David. Straight after Mark, within a few weeks, we spoke to Linden from GWEC, so that's the Global Wind Energy Council, which was a very different conversation. What were our takeaways from there?
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, so it's interesting. You're right. It's completely different, but similar in the sense that the World Bank's trying to get markets to evolve and develop that maybe don't exist yet. GWEC is almost saying, yeah, okay, we support that. But how do we get those countries that we have identified as high potential and move them further forward, right? And Ning Chow is the head of the Southeast Asia part of GWEC, and there you have a really interesting, essentially second phase of development for world markets that's going on there. But it's interesting, Ning described the area at a very, very early stage of development. Right, this decade is essentially the decade of setting the foundations, making mistakes. Right, it's good to hear someone saying it's okay to make mistakes because you are going to make mistakes in an oil market. But then its next decade is about delivery in some respects, and that area is fascinating because it has Taiwan in it. Right, and Taiwan, as Ning sort of describes in the podcast, is kind of the template of how do you get then a market to get to a phase of development where people feel comfortable to invest.
Yeah.
So it's worth listening to the podcast in its own way to listen to almost her defense of Taiwan, which has got some criticism for like local content and we're not moving fast enough and you're making mistakes. Well, that's kind of normal when you're developing and evolving a market. The European lesson as such is similar, in fact. So that's worth listening to just from that. But it's then also worth kind of thinking about what else is in the region and what's moving faster and slower. And that's really where, obviously, we spend a lot of our time as well, and comparing and contrasting places like Vietnam and the Philippines, and why would they even take this big infrastructure project called offshore wind and include it as part of their decarbonisation kind of solutions. And so that discussion is fascinating because it moves on from the kind of art of the possible to the kind of, okay, how does it actually happen? What has been happening in that region? And where are some of the fast and slow markets? And the classic question is obviously then, how much can you borrow from Europe in terms of similarities, so cost inflation, supply chain challenges, financing? It's kind of all the same in some respects with the local context. But then that's the point, the local context. That's where things differ. That's how you have to really think about, well, what has that market got? What have those areas got that really change the way you have to develop your projects, the way you finance, the way you move them forward? So, well worth a listen. It's a regional perspective, but it's a region that's kind of the one after Europe, and so it's worth sort of understanding what's going on there.
Yeah, I think it also raises some interesting questions and robust challenges as there needs to be around capability and pace.
Absolutely.
But have a listen for yourselves. This is Linden of GWIC.
Where we are in terms of the ambition, how we are progressing on meeting those ambitions. I think this is a very interesting decade now to 2030. This is the decade where offshore wind is coming to Asia. It's coming out of Europe and it's coming to Asia and also get developed in North America. But this decade of offshore really coming to Asia is actually a time where we are defining the rule of the game, or in other words, the route to market for offshore to get developed. This is the time, or this decade is the time where the regulators are learning about how to deploy offshore wind. What should that framework of policy look like? And they have been making some mistakes by just introducing the processes, the leasing processes before a proper marine spatial planning is done, which we've seen like happening in a few markets. And they're also like trying to figure out the whole processes of how auction should be designed, whether they should choose one-stage auction or they should choose two-stage auction. This is a big kind of learning period, and there are mistakes. There are processes put into place to kind of rectify the mistakes. But this is like I said just now, the rule of the game being set up. Yeah. And that means that if we are just focusing on the target, we probably won't see the target or that ambition being met in that way. But this is also very important that once you get all the rules right in place on track, then the next decade is the delivery decade. And it's actually not only the delivery decade, but also the acceleration decade, which I believe will really be the case. And I think that just means that these few years between now and 2030 is super interesting, and that can also be super complicated or confusing for some of the markets and for some of the newcomers to the markets. But this is also like a super interesting time that you see things being shaped up. You see how dynamics is between the industry and the government. And for us as the industry associations, which our mission is actually to help the industry to get the right policy in place. And we are on a daily basis talking to the different national governments to basically advise them on how the policy framework should look like. Our work is quite interesting in that sense. And we see lots of like common cases or common kind of like issues across different markets. And being able to advise the government on those issues is also make our work really interesting and rewarding in some of the cases.
Linden from GWIC. So we move on to the third episode. I really enjoyed listening to the third one. I have to say, we had Johan Sandberg, CEO of Seaflow.
Yes.
Really entertaining podcast, really good energy, and also brought in the technology aspect.
Absolutely.
Tell us a bit more.
Yeah, and you're right, it was an enjoyable one because he has passion, right?
Yeah.
And you can tell in this industry in particular, there's a lot of passion there. Because it is in an earlier stage of development relative to maybe some, but passion is needed to move some of this forward because you have sometimes a long way to go. So C12 as such, and when you listen to the podcast yourself, well, you have, but others, they will hear a little bit around the kind of innovative nature, of that technology. So if you think about, wind industry started with what's called fixed bottoms, essentially drilling or piling, piling to the ground, the seabed. Now we're talking about floating wind, which is about having a floating foundation and anchoring that, or whatever you might be doing. And then thirdly, this concept is almost a third iteration of that, where you're saying it's floating, but you're having a vertical axis wind turbine rather than a horizontal, which is the traditional. It's the one that the technology that was chosen to scale for various reasons. So what's fascinating about what Johan really talks about and describes is he recognizes that there are multiple technology choices. I think I called him a veteran at the time. In the grand scheme of things, he is a veteran, even though the industry's young, but he's been in it his whole life. So it's worth listening to kind of just the story of floating wind in itself. But it's that recognition that there are still many technology choices to make as we go through kind of the evolution of that industry. But also, really importantly, and this is where I think he's going to be a good CEO, you can tell, because he's recognizing what he's got is innovative and different, and it's going to play a really interesting role. And he describes really clearly why that is. So it's probably one of our more technical podcasts, and you know, you should listen because it's an important point, right? This is engineering and infrastructure. Yeah. But also, and then benefits being, what I love is things like the supply chain angle, where you can use a lot of the local supply chain, you know, the different sort of benefits that kind of vertical access turbine brings, etc. But on top of that, also a sense of realism, right? And that's really important, the realism that this is going to provide a solution for certain applications. It's going to provide a, you know, solution maybe in some locations, not in others, and that's because there are still a lot of unknowns, essentially, right? And you know, yes, it's a startup. So C12 have had a demo in the water since 2015, and some got lots of data and insight, but they're still bringing out new iterations. And so that's what I liked about this was we've got a good history, got a good understanding of what's going on. We've got a lot of passion and enthusiasm, but a sense of realism as well as to what's going to happen, or could happen, excuse me, to the industry, but specifically also, you know, the company he's representing. And I think, was it last week or so, depending on when you're listening to this, obviously it'll be a few weeks later, you know, they made their first commercial revenues. And that's a great positive story to tell, but it's also a nice realistic story to tell. And it's worth listening to that. So, you know, technology, key important factor, what's the reality check?
Absolutely. Well, let's take a listen. This is Johan Sandberg, CEO of C12.
I mean, if you look at where the bottom fixed industry was some 10 years ago, we were also there. We were also at more than €100 or pound per megawatt hour.
Yeah.
And it was also a huge concern that will we actually be able to break the €100 mark, you know, in the next few years or so, or what else? You know, what would happen if we don't? Would support disappear, or what would happen? But the industry managed to do that, and also very quickly. And I think it was due to huge investments in the infrastructure. So all the vessels that we see now building these bottom fixed projects, they were basically sort of built or invested in back then. And that brought down the cost of energy for offshore wind, along with the investments in the yards, the mass production of monopiles, you know, the fantastic development of the turbines and all that. So the industry managed to do that through these huge investments. So, you know, if you need billions into the yards to produce floating wind turbines, I think that can happen. And I think that can reduce the cost of energy for floating as well. So I'm optimistic about that. What concerns me, though, is just the fact that there are so huge targets now for the whole offshore wind industry, bottom fixed as well, that the sheer volume of turbine demand is going to also be a constraint, a bottleneck. And if there is just so much demand for bottom fixed projects, would it be natural to sort of focus on the floating as well? Would you have a risk premium or just additional costs from the OEMs to floating? And would that then make it a bit less attractive? How could that play out? Just the fact that we have such a bottleneck in the OEM turbine space is a concern, I think. And then, you know, like you said, you have this the zero, what's it called now, the European equivalent of the IRA, you know, Zero Emission Act or whatever. That's going to sort of try to keep production within Europe. So, you know, Chinese turbines, are they going to be able to cover that sort of gap? I'm not so sure, but I think the industry is still in a little bit of a risk there, because we need to see the cost compression in floating offshore wind as well. And I think the politicians need to see that coming in the next, say, 8 to 10 years. Otherwise, we could risk, you know, support being pulled back. So we need to demonstrate that we can achieve this cost compression for sure.
So that was Johan Sandberg of C12. And David, we sort of went then from a technology viewpoint into, you know, there's a lot of ambition, there's a lot of passion around offshore wind. But ultimately, the question is, can you develop that? You know, how real is it? What needs to happen to realise those ambitions? And that's when we spoke to, or you did rather, Justine Berg of Equinor.
Absolutely, yeah, thank you. And Equinor's been someone who's certainly been seen as a pioneer in this industry, so it was really great to have them on and talk of the development perspective, right? It's about delivering some of those ambitions that are out there. And so if you think about the North Sea, the birthplace that we've got now, we're talking about 30 plus or so gigawatts. That wants to get to 300 gigawatts by 2050. And so we're trying to throw a lot into one space, and that's not just the only place. The whole world is trying to suddenly go from a very small size industry to covering as much of the ocean as you can. Slight exaggeration, but but you get the idea, right? It's essentially really a hockey stick type situation that we're trying to create.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting. I mean, it can turn into a very negative conversation, but actually what I think it was, and certainly what Justine did a great job on, is making it a practical and realistic conversation around what is it going to take to deliver all of this capacity, especially in Europe, where her focus is. And so we talked around really some of the challenges that the industry is facing. And I think she bucketed, as far as I remember, I think we would normally talk about it slightly differently, but she bucketed it as a project development. So why does it take 10 years to develop a project? Really shouldn't take that long, right? And there are a whole series of issues around that. And she does that very well on the podcast explaining it. The second area is we've got a really interesting macro picture right now. So that's about cost of borrowing's gone up, inflation more generally. So back to our white paper that we did that really shows the kind of 20% plus general inflationary impact that you're seeing in the industry, and just sort of other sort of bit of supply chain, essentially bottlenecks and similar sort of factors happening there. So you kind of got a general macro problem as such of cost and deliverability happening. And then the third point is around auctions and how auctions are designed, right? Auctions are essentially your entry point to this industry. It's the way you get seabed to be able to develop something. And those have been evolving and developing. And if you go way back, and we wrote a great thematic report on this actually, as to how has that evolved and developed from, can I get some seabed to, yes you can, to now, okay, you have to auction it, okay, you have to pay exorbitant amounts of money for it, which in a short space of time that's happened. And now what's happening is those auctions are asking for people to bid on a multitude of things. Like, can you please deliver a supply chain with your project? Can you please ensure that you have sustainable products as part of your development, etc. So you're suddenly having to think of these sort of non-price factors and other sort of things in a very competitive landscape. So if you take those three things around project development, auction design, and macro kind of inflation and sort of difficulty, you kind of sit back and go, whoa, that's really difficult. But the overarching question that was then asked by Justine, I think this is useful listening to the whole podcast just for this bit, is the business model wrong? Is it's all about cost reduction and the whole conversation about cost reduction, and that's the only thing we should be thinking about? Is that the only kind of way forward for this industry? Yeah. Or do we need to reinvent, rethink things a little bit? So it's probably the most grown up of all the conversations in the sense of, wow, okay, it's exciting, there's great opportunity. Yes, we recognize there's underlying issues, there's technology, this is how you grow a market from a policy perspective, wonderful. But hang on, when you start to really try and deliver, and deliverability is a term I've been using way too much recently, but when you start to deliver, what are the things you need to think about? That's not a negative thought, that's a practical reality thought. And I think that's really sort of strong discussion to have and a wonderful discussion to have. And hopefully we're going to see some of the governments react to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we said earlier, there needs to be a robust challenge, these things need to be pulled apart and looked at so the industry can grow with strength.
Absolutely.
And actually some of the non-price factors you mentioned there, we spoke about in the webinar recently I think Peter Lloyd Williams did a piece on it as well. So that's something you can go and look up. So you and I take a break for a minute, and we'll cut to Justine Berg of Equinor.
How this will affect in general projects, a bit difficult to really say, but I think it's a time to pause and reflect. Yes, definitely. Some companies might need to borrow more or not, use more balance sheets, assessing the portfolio, the project by project. Will it be delays, renegotiating terms? Yeah, I think that will trigger lots of discussion. How will this affect as well competition in tenders? I think that's also quite uncertain, but it gives a time to pause and reflect, and whether it's a reset or change of more business models. Could be, I'm not saying, but it triggers some key reflection. On the other hand, right, as we've discussed as the intro, is that the targets have never been that higher, right? So there needs to be that match between this deliverability and also this ambition levels.
Justine Berg there of Equinor. Dave, just before we cut to Justine, we start talking about sustainability, which will lead into our final podcast. But how is the concept of sustainability being looked at from an offshore wind point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you're absolutely right. So to mention it really in the concept of auctions, but the point of bringing Maximilian in, who's the head of sustainability at Siemens Gamesa, so one of the OEMs, the wind turbine manufacturers, was to try and dig a little bit more into that area, because it's starting to gain more traction and interest within the broader scope of things, which I think are called non-price factors or wider benefits. And so, you know, we could have picked a whole series of things, but this one seems particularly important because, for one thing, it's financiers, clients, and consumers more generally are demanding this, right? They seem to be demanding this. And then governments are essentially regulating for it to be a core part of an industry. So if it's in an auction, that basically means you're going to have to deliver on that aspect of it, whether you like it or not, right? This is now a core part of how you deliver. Yeah. But also the broader sphere, this is relatively EU-centric, but it is broadening out beyond that conversation. You know, it's things like the something called the CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is requiring sort of higher carbon products, such as steel, which is a major part of, let's say, a wind turbine, to pay a tariff if it's going to be imported. So you want to try and produce it locally, but you're going to have to produce it obviously at a lower carbon cost as well. If you are going to import it, also have a lower carbon intensity. So things like those types of regulations and the Critical Raw Materials Act and those things are just essentially forcing companies to go down the route of, I'm going to produce a more sustainable product. But also financiers and consumers, etc., are demanding it as well. So you've got this kind of multitude of things come together, which is saying, okay, actually starting to become quite important. On top of that, it's also a picture and a story which is leading to the ability to differentiate yourself, right? If you get to a point where price, so if you think about discussion with Justine around, you know, is price the only factor you should be thinking about, and the worries that the industry has. So if price is not your only competitive factor, can it be sustainability? Can you bring that out as a core reason as to why you would pick one product above another, as an example? And it's also a competitive advantage, maybe if you are faster at developing a technology that others would like to see because they're trying to deliver on their sustainability targets. Again, it's a point of differentiation. Yeah. So it's for manufacturers, but also the industry as a whole, that's important. What is fascinating, of course, is this is a pretty big challenge, right? And it's easy to say we should be more sustainable and set a science-based target to get to 1.5 degree scope 1, 2, 3 target for your company. The reality is, someone like a Siemens Gamesa, I think he was saying you've got something like 20,000 suppliers, right? And the majority of your problem, your CO2, for example, 90% plus, sits in your supply chain. Yeah. So you're really going to have to figure out if this is a differentiator. I'm having to deliver on it because the developers out there are bidding in auctions that require them to deliver on this. how do I work with 20,000 different supply chain individuals or companies, excuse me, to essentially deliver on this? It becomes a fascinating challenge. And more broadly, we sort of link to this, but it's worth thinking about is, okay, what about other turbine manufacturers that come from other parts of the world where this is less of a problem for them, or less of a question for them? All they're going to do is go for the cheapest product. And then the balance between sustainability and cost becomes even more interesting to try and work through. So it's a fascinating discussion because it could be fundamentally important to the way the industry evolves, but also it could become a real problem for the industry as well if it doesn't know how to manage to deal with it.
It's not a unique problem in terms of global industry.
Absolutely.
Many different industries have faced this for a very long time. They've been under a lot more of a spotlight than offshore wind or any sort of energy producing industry.
Absolutely.
So it's a tough challenge, but also one that perhaps can be looked to other industries for how it's been coped with there.
I totally agree. What's fascinating here is you think renewable energy and you go, why you are a sustainable thing that you're doing, but actually everything needs to be built, manufactured and developed. So that's why it's fascinating. And the other part, of course, is you're a small fish, right? So the offshore wind industry is 6% global steel demand. If you're going to request a change in the global steel production, okay, you can say something, but you're essentially 38th in the queue in terms of someone wanting to make a change. So it's a challenge, more of a challenge, if you're the little fish as such, but it's even more of a challenge if it's essentially regulated and demanded of you, but you need many other people to change. And you're right, many other industries are in the same boat, and there's a lot to learn from them as well.
Okay, so let's have a listen as a snippet from our final podcast with Maximilian Schnippering of Siemens Gamesa.
Yeah, as you rightfully say, we are still a quite small off-taker from many of the traditional markets and products that we are utilizing in the wind turbines. And therefore, one of the biggest challenge is here still cost and capacity availability in the market. So those are really drivers that we need to incorporate. And if we take a look at the cost, then for us really important, we need to decide also as UK, as Europe, how do we want to build up our supply chains and how do we want to work with the OEMs together? Do we want to have purely cost-focused supply chains? Then we will always opt for the low-cost countries, most likely, that are available and have a cost-competitive advantage. Or do we want to work in more sustainable terms, more diversified terms? Then we need to make this also a parameter in the decision-making. And yes, we have this really promising outlook of growth in our industry. But the growth that we see is also twofold. So on the one side, it's growth in terms of we want to build more and more turbines. But next to that also, turbines become bigger and bigger. So if we talk about capacity and availability, then there's only very little suppliers in Europe to date available that can produce the really big steel parts, castings, forgings that we need for our turbines. There are also very limited suppliers in Europe available that can do the very small parts like screws, nuts, bolts, and the like. So there's a lot of missing supply chains available somewhere else. And also there's a lot of fight for capacity with different industries. If we look, for example, at carbon fibers, we are anticipated to be also a growing off-taker of carbon fibers in the future, specifically for the very long offshore blades. But also aerospace is getting into the carbon fiber market. And the quantities and volumes will be much bigger than for us. So it will be, again, difficult how to compete on these markets. And therefore getting access to the quantities needed, that's really one of the big challenges. And also getting access then to the sustainable products thereof, because in our industry, it's not so easy like for other industry to pass on additional costs to customers, because we are far away from the end customer. Ultimately, we have our customer who again will need to deal in this market, That is not like you buy, I don't know, a bottle of apple juice, where you maybe can differently work on your pricing scheme then. So that makes it really difficult in our industry, but something where you still can see, and then I will always come back to my statement I made earlier, nothing will stop this green transition here and the pathway we are on, because you really can see that if we want to be successful also going forward as Europe, as UK, we need to transition to greener technologies to differentiate ourselves by more sustainable products compared to cheaper products.
So that was Maximilian Schnippering from Siemens Gamesa, and at this point we'll say thank you to all of our guests on this series. That was the last one in the mini-series of Offshore Wind. Coming up, we've got Hydrogen Focus in September, so watch your inboxes for that coming through. We'll just keep going back to the Westwood site. David, before we close off though, any final thoughts on the interviews and guests we've had on this series?
Yeah, hopefully when folks do listen to it, they'll notice the kind of, again, the diversity that's required to really understand the industry from multiple angles. This is an industry really going from a more niche, sort of regionally bounded kind of play to something that's trying to go global. And this is a story many industries are going, but this one's a little different in the sense that it is an industrial concept that we're developing. Interestingly, the thing to consider is there's a lot of good people working very hard. You think the World Bank is involved here, right? The GWEC is really pushing this around the globe. A lot of people trying to make this industry happen in many parts of the world. But something that Mark Claiborne said I thought was fascinating is it's not for everybody, right? So you're going to end up working with governments essentially that want this in their backyard. They want this to develop, right? Countries have many options. So it's about working in countries and with companies that want to see this development evolve. And once you have that want and desire, what we do see, and this is again like North Sea and other parts of the world, the ambition's really high, right? And then that's what's fascinating. So once you're hooked in, you see the exciting opportunity and you try and make it happen. But it's only going to happen in certain parts of the world at different sort of speeds because it requires that buy-in from governments. And then once you do get going, key phrase, deliverability. How are you going to deliver on this? And again, it's not the same as something like solar or other things. This is big industrial stuff that needs to happen, and that really needs to be thought through. And it's going to take iteration, it's going to take time. Business models need to evolve, economies change, and being mindful of that is really important. But there's a lot to go for. Great technology is being evolved, great ambition out there. So personally, very excited about what's coming next.
Absolutely, it's a great industry to be in. So that's it from us. As I said earlier on, we've got the next mini-series coming up in September with Joyce Grigori, our Director of Hydrogen, and as you can guess, that series is going to be on hydrogen. But until then, you've got access to all the previous series on the Westwood website, as well as the transcripts of each episode, and a bit more in terms of bios, and a bit more about those businesses as well. You can also, have to get a plug in, go to the website and find out more about WindLogic's, our bespoke offshore wind solution. Go and have a look. If you need some more information, please get in touch. But as usual, we welcome your feedback on the whole podcast series. So from David and myself, thanks for joining. Take care. Bye-bye.